Hola, clase. So today I wanted to go over the formal commands. Um, Now this is assuming that we're familiar with the informal commands already. This video will be pretty brief. Um, I wanted to make a new video about this because I had another video you may have already seen, but it was assuming that we already knew the subjunctive. It's one that I actually use for my upperclassmen. So that I've already learned how to form the subjunctive. So it makes it a lot easier with that video if you already have that knowledge. But assuming you don't have any knowledge of how to conjugate in the present subjunctive, this is the video you should use. So as I say that, it also assumes that you do have knowledge with the informal commands, specifically the negative informal commands, the -2 commands, because the process that we use to form the -2 command is the same process we're going to use to form the formal command, the usted command, affirmative and negative. So let's take a peek. Here's some of our infinitives. And when we were to form these in the -2 command, we had those 3 steps that we usually followed. We went to that first step of the yo form, which is what you can see here. We got limpiar to limpio. That's our yo form. Then we took that O off and we're left with limpi because the O is gone. And then we added the opposite vowel. You can see this is an AR verb. Being that it's an AR verb, the opposite vowel would be the letter E. And when we were doing the -2, we added an S as well. We're doing that same process here to form the usted command, but now we are going to, instead of the opposite vowel plus S, we're just going to do the opposite vowel and stop there. So instead of no limpies, we're just going to use limpie. Now, another thing that's kind of cool about this, makes it a little bit easier than what we've done with the informal commands, is that this is the form for the usted affirmative and the negative. We just put a no in front of it. I'll go a little more in detail on the negatives in a minute because we still need to differentiate with our object pronoun placement when it's affirmative versus negative, but the actual verb form itself is going to be identical, whether it's affirmative or negative. This is different than what we did with the 2 form. The 2 form, we had the Vin Diesel words and the third person singular for the affirmative, and the negative was a whole different process. Well, same process here as the -2 commands, just without the S for affirmative and negative. So you can see some other examples. Barro, drop the O, it's an ER verb, A at the end, barra. Again, it would also be the negative, no barra. Sacudir, got an IR verb, sacudo, sacuda. Digo, so those first few, we had an AR, and ER, and IR verb that were regular. This isn't really that much of a stretch from everything you've learned from before we've learned anything about the command conjugations. But when we get to here, now we see the purpose of why we go to the yo form, because when you go to the yo form of this here, with digo, we got that G in there that wouldn't be there otherwise if we just used our normal stem. Pensar, when we go to the yo form, we got pienso. It's got the stem change in it. And if you have a stem change in the yo form of the present tense, you're going to have a stem change in the usted commands. And O to UE, also E to I. The stem change happens in the yo form. So we don't really need it. As long as you can get to the yo form, you'll be in good shape for most of these commands. We'll talk about some exceptions in a minute. So spoiler alert, you can see how these are all just formed the same way. We drop the O and we add the opposite vowel and nothing more, just the opposite vowel. But if you looked over at that far right column, it's very similar to what we did with the -2, what we did with usted. And now with ustedes, this is the plural command. We are also going to add an N to the end of it to make the conjugation plural, to make the command plural. So not a lot of extra information here to learn 2 new commands. Also, affirmative and negative will be identical. So this lesson is for the usted commands and the ustedes commands. Just going to skip through some of these things, but we've learned this stuff before. So these all have irregular verbs in the yo form. They're irregular conjugations. Conducir becomes conduzco. So it's got a CONDUZCO in the yo form. So that ZC is going to be together because we just dropped the O when we make this conjugation. Be conduzca usted, conduzcan ustedes. Conocer, also similar to conducir, it's conozco, so conozca, conozcan. Decir, we just talked about digo, so digan, digan. Hacer, it becomes hago, H-A-G-O, drop the O. You get haga when you add the opposite vowel. Hagan when you add the opposite vowel plus N for ustedes. Ofrecer, ZCO again, just like these two were, conducir and conocer. Ofrezco, ofrezca, ofrezcan are your conjugations. Oír becomes oigo. You can see it here, oiga. Poner, pongo, so it becomes ponga and pongan. Salir, salgo, tener, tengo, traduzco, traigo, vengo, veo. So that irregularity that happens here is going to keep when we have the usted commands and ustedes commands, just instead of an O at the end, we're going to have the opposite vowel, or ustedes will have opposite vowel plus N. So we talk about the stem change. We have a stem change in these, if it has a stem change in the yo form, it'll have the stem change in usted and ustedes. All right, so this is the other thing we mentioned back in when we were learning the informal commands, the two commands, the negative two commands, that is that gar, car, sar verbs, these also have an additional change that we have to keep in mind. So we can't just follow the yo form rule, yo form drop O opposite ending. We also have to add a step in there. And the order of that doesn't really matter. If you go to the yo form and you end up with sacar, you go saco, S-A-C-O. That works just fine. Actually, I can type in here. So saco is what you'd end up with the yo form, and then we drop the O, and then you add the opposite vowel. Now that doesn't work. That would be sase, sase. That C is pronounced like an S sound there, or a TH if we're in España. But this has to have a spell change. So you can see here, C becomes QU. So we change that C to QU. Now we have our usted conjugation. We're making that plural, saquen with an N at the end. So again, the order doesn't necessarily matter. I went saco here and then dropped the O. And then now we could just change that C to a QU and then add the E. Or when I first showed it, I did this and then I added the E and then I changed this to QU. Really, it's just a matter of you just recognize that it's a car verb. When you recognize it's a car verb, you just turn that C into a QU as you go through the process. Jugar, similar deal. We've got juego. So this one's a little bit more unique in that we've got juego here. It's got a stem change there, but it's also going to have a spell change. G is going to be GU, and then we add our opposite vowel, and you get juegue and jueguen. So the stem change is going to keep, and the spell change is going to be used as well. So we got a stem change and a spell change with this verb. Let's go down to almorzar. It becomes almuerzo in the yo form. Drop the O. Also going to change the Z to a C to be consistent with our spelling combinations, and almuerce and almuerce. So again, you've done this before. The same process that we had with the -2. All right, now informal, I'm sorry, here from the formal, these conjugations, when you go to the yo form, they don't end in O. So that's just a nice way for us to know that these are irregular and there's a little bit more to it. So yo form of that is doy. That ends with Y. We can't drop the O at the end. So that's just kind of a little trigger for you to say like, oh, it doesn't end in O. That means it's one of those irregulars, which just means we have to memorize them. Now, they're not too crazy to memorize because they do have, besides like maybe this P out of, from saber, we get to put the P in there, and this Y, and that Y, which ear is always a weird one. So for the most part, though, they kind of keep, D is your stem, and then it's an AR verb. You use the E as the opposite ending. We got estar, EST is the stem, EST is the stem here, and it's an AR verb, so you use E as the opposite ending. So there are some traits here that are consistent with what we've learned already. So they're irregular, but they're not as bad as some of the other irregular forms that we've learned. All right, so anyway, these are the forms: de, este, vaya, sepa, and sea. You'll notice we have 2 accent marks here. We've got de with an accent mark and este. They're accent marks that are used for different reasons. This one is because we want to stress this last syllable, este. We stress that final vowel is going to be stressed here. Same thing happens in the plural. We stress that final vowel. So we have an accent mark on there because that breaks our normal expected rule. And here, this is just so we know that it's not the preposition de, as in of or from. So we know this is a verb. If we had without an accent mark, it'd be a preposition. With the accent mark, it is a verb. So that's the purpose of that. You're only going to see that in the usted form because it's the only time that we have, when it comes to commands, that we have the de spelling. Because when we go here, then we don't have a preposition that's spelled like that. When we had the negative two form, no this, we didn't have a preposition that was spelled des. So we didn't have to worry about it. But here we will have to worry about it. So this is the only exception. If you were to take, if you knew all the negative two forms that you had from previous lessons, all the negative two forms, you could just drop the S of all of those conjugations, and then that would be your usted form. So we learned these. This was des, estés, vayas, sepas, and seas. Just they all had S's on the end. The only exception to that rule that doesn't work out perfectly is right here. And that's only because there's an accent mark now on the usted form. Otherwise, every single verb, if I went back to, right here, this was no saques, no juegues, no almuerces with the same spelling. I go back to those other irregulars here. This would be no oigas, no salgas, no pongas, no hagas. We had everything was the same, just had an S at the end instead. So that all keeps, the only exception is right here. There's an accent mark on that E. All right, so we also already alluded to this, but whenever making a negative command, we put a no in front of the conjugation, but it's the same form, whether it's affirmative or negative. Ponga, we're saying don't put the suitcase on the bed, but if we were just saying put the suitcase on the bed, we'd get rid of that no and just say ponga las maletas en la cama. And that's for usted, and for ustedes. Ensucian los sillones would be dirty the chairs instead of no ensucian, don't dirty them. So pronouns. This is another thing I mentioned before. Now, the verb form itself is identical, but we do have to treat them differently, whether they're affirmative or negative when it comes to pronouns. So if we're adding an object pronoun, if we have an object pronoun that we're going to include with our conjugation, we need to attach it to affirmative commands. And now when we do that, we typically will end up with an accent mark. Now I do have a separate video on how to handle accent marks, but basically it's whatever our verb is, in this case it's sienten. The second to last syllable right here is the verb that's the syllable that is stressed. Now, when I add another syllable, like the say here, I have to put that reflexive pronoun at the end. When I attach it, it is now the third from last syllable. We expect it to be the second to last syllable. So when it's not the second to last, we need to write an accent mark to show where the stress actually is. Otherwise, we'd assume it's right here. So it's not there. So whenever you're starting, whatever your verb is, here we'll see sigame. Our conjugation is siga. There's our verb. Now, we can always assume that this is the stressed syllable, that second to the end. It's always got to count from the end. Here's the end of the verb. This is the last syllable. This is the second to last syllable. Well, there's the second to last vowel sound. So there's siga. That's the stressed syllable. Now, when I add the may, when I add that to the end of the conjugation, let's count the end. Here's the last syllable. Here's the second to last syllable. That's where we'd expect it to be, but we know it's actually here. The stress syllable never changes. It's just its relation to the end does. So we change this to an accent mark. I know I can't see it that well, but there is an accent mark on that I, as you can see it here probably a little bit better. But this is sigame. We got to put the accent mark on it because it is our it breaks the rule of what we expect the stress syllable to be. Our stress syllable should be the second to last syllable when it ends with a vowel N or S. And when it's not, we need to write the accent mark to show that. Now, when it comes to well, this is actually just going over, but same thing I just explained. Pause this if you want to look at that a little bit more closely. All right, so when they're negative though, so we have the same verb forms as we have with affirmative, but when they're negative and we have an object pronoun, we have to put the object pronoun before the verb, after the no, but before the verb, directly in front of it. So No se preocupe, again, preocupe would be the conjugation, and that's what I think you'd expect it to be. If it were affirmative, this se would go at the end here, be attached to it, and we'd end up with an accent mark on that U. But being that it's negative, it goes before it. We don't have to worry about accent marks. As long as you know what the conjugation is, accent marks won't change. Nothing will change. We won't add any accent marks when it comes to forming the negative commands. And then here, remember we got multiple objects. Whenever we have that, remember rid, reflexive goes first, indirect goes next, and then direct. So in this case, we got an indirect and then we got a direct. That's the order it has to go in. Another one here, indirect, direct. But they go before the conjugation every time. If it's a negative, you see all those no's. The no's means it's negative. When it's negative, object pronoun goes before the conjugation. Affirmative, we attach it to it, and you're probably going to need an accent mark. All right. Well, that is all I have for you for today. Again, if you have a good knowledge of the -2 commands already, this should be a cakewalk for you. If you're still kind of a little bit iffy on how to form this, you can also go back. I've got a lot of videos on how to form the -2 command. I recommend you start from there if this is still a struggle. Bueno, hasta la próxima.